What the virtual world has removed is, and as Nicola rightly just said there, the fact that SEND is very verbose, and for some people and some parents this is a major barrier. So what we've been able to do with the virtual meetings is that parents feel somehow better equipped to challenge officers and other professionals within the meetings, so we've been able to offer more of those. We've also listening more to our parent carers together. We've done road shows to different schools where there has been perhaps tension between the school leaders and SEND parents. So that is whereby we've done those coffee mornings, road shows. I've done more and more of SENCO networks. We've also established SENCO ambassadors who, from their part, and there are 12 of those in the city, will listen to parents in their schools and bring the items to us. We also have parents who want to talk about a particular thing that's gone really well for their young person and why that's happened. The virtual world again has encouraged those parents and youngsters to come forward. So that's the particular change, but I wouldn't say that we are surveying. We are always asking parents' views once they're new to plan, after an annual review. Of course, we do a lot of mediation as well, so we're the second most improved authority in the country in terms of reduction of tribunals and other significant measure that will bring that satisfaction and the meaning of it in Derby City parents into a bit of a front.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions from the floor? Councillor Banter?
Thank you. I think you've answered it to some extent. I was just going back to the area 5, the parent satisfaction again, and I mean, I note that you're using the forums and what have you to get the feedback. But what I'm concerned about is the parents who don't engage in that process, bearing in mind that, you know, some parents of SEND pupils are marginalised themselves. You have covered it to some extent, but are you targeting all, are you going to be able to engage with all parents? I do have some concerns over just the meeting time being an opportunity to challenge and to make comments. Often people need time to reflect, and that can be a daunting experience in itself, as discussed, attending those sorts of formal meetings. So I suppose the question is, what else are you doing to reach the hard-to-reach parents? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah, and absolutely right there. It's not just about meetings. Of course, this is not just about those who've got an education, health and care plan. So it's more about listening to parents in the places where they're at. So children, young people go to settings, to schools, to college, and there needs to be that open-minded leadership in schools to engage with parents. And that's something that we're addressing particularly around our Derby, Living My Best Life Derby inclusion tool, which will look into the school's readiness for meeting SEND. So of course, we want that every child would be able to go to the school of their catchment with support. For 2% or so, it is not possible, and they need further support. But for most children and young people, that should be where they're looking into. It's not about the local authority actually opening up those channels to have wider discussion and exchange with parents. It's to do with schools. It's to be braver in that. And some of our leaders have said that they haven't always felt that they are able to do that. So we've addressed that, and we all know we have got views of schools who are inclusive and those who may not be inclusive for various reasons, and some of them are very personal, and they come from the experiences that you've had and we've had. So that is something that we got to, as a system, become more inclusive. That also means that we're having those conversations with our social care and health colleagues so that we all understand that actually the best place for any child is to be with their peers and within their community, and we shouldn't go beyond those professional barriers to be suggesting that someone should have, for example, an EHC plan. We should be looking in the graduated response first and foremost and try with that early intervention to ensure that we can see and hear those views. So what we're going through is really kind of training and understanding across the piece that everyone's got to have those good conversations with parents. When we look at the HCP team, that is the absolute top of the iceberg of a massive continuum that we have in SEND or any child's or young person's educational journey. So we got to start having those conversations because, you know, that EHCP team, they don't have the relations with the people until they come to that plan stage. So those experiences, and especially those that haven't been the ones that you expected and you wanted, they've been had, and we've got to ensure that the sector becomes better at meeting the needs of Derby children. You know, we cannot change the children we have in the Derby, we need to change the system.
Okay, any further questions? Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to say I couldn't agree more with the reduction in surveys. I think as parents that are already dealing with an awful lot of stress and having to go through educational healthcare plans and everything else, I think, I suppose the question is, do we get a disproportionate response to those? Because it's like with any service, you tend to only comment when you've got a complaint, not when you've had the positive experiences, because ultimately, you know, you tend to be more responsive if you've got an issue. You don't tend to often sing, and we know this from any job that anybody's ever been in, you don't get praise for doing the job that you do at a day-to-day basis. It's only when something's wrong that somebody likes to comment and let you know. And I think that's where the survey element is a thing that we need to come away from. And I think having these, the forums, you mentioned the people within the 12 advocates.
Yes, and ambassadors, yes.
Absolutely fantastic, and getting more schools involved. And I think that, for me, getting the feedback and bringing that into the things that we've talked about here today, will get a much better feedback as to what the issues are.
Yeah, and that's some learning that I can take from East Midlands. If I talk to my SEND lead colleagues across the East Midlands and wider, they're saying that parents are tired of being surveyed and they'd like to talk to the first person where the problem occurs and not to take it to local authority. Thank you.
Okay, any further questions? No? Okay. So moving on to the recommendations then, to consider the presentation and make any further comments on recommendations following discussions on the presentations received. Do you have any comments on that? Any recommendations?
Yeah, I think we as a board we know and are pleased to see the progress that's been made, but it's a really important area that we've been pursuing and other boards have been in previous years have been pursuing. And I do think we need some kind of update in 6 months, which deals with some of the things we've touched upon, such as, you know, parents' engagement and attitudes, right? Also, how schools are coming around to this and being more in this system of and this fully in the culture that other partners are in, and also an update on the progress on the Single Inclusion Action Plan and what impact that's having.
Just with the 6-month review, is it worth adding on the target time? Because I see it's 18 weeks and it currently is 31. So just to bring that back in 6 months and see if it's getting closer to 18 weeks rather than going back to 52, what it was previously.
Absolutely, yes, we could add that in as well. Yes. So are we all agreed on that recommendation? Is there anybody against?
Not to be against it at all. Obviously, that information is really important. I think it'd be good to hear from the officers about whether that should be within 6 months or a year, a smaller review in 6 months and then a proper review in a year when those things have had more time to embed and the new systems have had more time to embed, because I am always conscious of the pressures on officers and we don't want that to impact on the outcomes and the ability to be able to achieve the changes. So it's just to ask that question to officers if we feel that there's a sort of two-level approach to this, of a basic update of those information and then a more of a challenged, detailed update within 12 months.
I think that would be very welcome, because that's what the Ofsted approach is in this. So clearly they are going to continue with the scrutiny that they've had, which is rightly so, but they will ask for a 6-month update and then a proper bigger one across all areas within a year.
Thank you. I do think, however, that the board, and I think our recommendation, my recommendation is that it would be coming back to the board in 6 months. It's up to us as a scrutiny board to ensure that we're scrutinising and we are actually watching that and scrutinising it as it goes along. So my recommendation will be that we go in 6 months, we have the report back in 6 months. So
Chair, I'd agree with that. I do think we need to look at it in 6 months.
So you second
and
that,
I don't rule out the fact that a year from now we'll want a fuller picture and a more in-depth report back. But I think in the next 6 months we need to see progress. Absolutely. And I'm sure officers will be able to demonstrate that. I have every confidence in that, but we need to seek that reassurance and challenge, if necessary, whatever we're given in that report.
Absolutely. I gather you second that then, Councillor Hazelgrave. Okay, so are we all happy on that? Is there any against? 1. Okay, so that's carried then. Thank you.
Are we allowed to make all the recommendations, Chair?
Further recommendation? Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. As I say, I'd just like to make a further recommendation that we're more specific on what it is that we're asking officers to bring back in 6 months, the data that we're expecting, so that it could be more specified, and rather than, I mean, the approach that was given then was absolutely fantastic, but I wouldn't expect there to be significant change in whole systems within 6 months. So I think we need to be clear on what we're actually, the expectations of what we're asking them to bring back. For example, the educational healthcare plan time scales, the 18 months, and it needs the 18 weeks needs to be compared with national as it has been tonight, and not just where we are as a city and the ideal. And obviously, so I would just make those suggestions, and that we should make it clear what we're actually asking for as a group.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Ralston. I would say that I wouldn't like to make too much comparison, and we'd like to be the best. So, yes, I think to clarify, so to go over that again, there was the AHEP timescales, a measure that captures the level of satisfaction among parents. Councillor Hazelgrave, the other points.
Yes, I just some input on what progress has been made on the Single Inclusion Action Plan.
Absolutely, and also the social care assessments. Ofsted inspectors were not sure if it was being done. Yeah, social care needs are not often documented in plans, and it wasn't clear to the inspectors where the social care assessments of the needs of children and young people with SEND have been offered. So we'd like to a reassurance that they are being offered. So I think that would be quite specific as well.
So Lynn, could I just come in at that point, because I've been part of the working group from a social care early help perspective, and as Paula alluded to, our system, the liquid logic system now means that it's going to go directly to workers. So we're just at the point of introducing this, which means that we won't have those lost emails and inboxes. It will go directly into a worker's tray with a comment that says this needs to be completed. For families that aren't known to us, where there's a consideration, it'll go into the front door, and the same via the same way through the portal. But also at that point we'll consider whether it's a single assessment for the children's needs or whether it both needs a parent carers needs assessment as well. So I'm sure Paula will be able to update you further, because 6 months on this will be working
I think that's
appropriately.
really
I
good,
think we could be
Chair.
really excited then to see progress on this in 6 months. Thank you very much, and I think that is an achievable objective. Thank you.
Chair, so just to clarify, the 6-month report that we were expecting back will cover those 4 elements that you've described tonight.
Yes, I think so. Is there anything else?
I do think we ought to have a recommendation that we note all the work and thank all the team's work for the progress so far, and we look forward to even greater progress in the future.
Yeah,
Thanks. The
absolutely.
teams will be absolutely delighted with that, because we don't often get it, we don't often hear it. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. So if there's no more recommendations, right, Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'd like to just make another recommendation. Obviously, the officers and the staff here, as you've pointed out, have been fantastic. I think we should make a recommendation to thank the Parent Carers Together forums, the CENDIAS, and all the partners that have really brought this together, especially the schools and the teams. I think it certainly hasn't been a councillor / city council approach, that we need to thank them for their massive input into this and to really turn it around. I think there's been significant improvements in the Parent Carers Together and their approaches to how they're actually bringing in information. It's not all negative, and I think that should be welcomed and thanked.
Absolutely. And just to add to that, I was rather disappointed that we didn't have the views from other parent groups, like Parent Living with Special Needs Today, which is an independent group that's not funded by the council. It would have been nice to hear their views as well. So I think we should thank all parent groups in the city, okay, as well. Thank you. So, any more? Okay, thank you very much. Okay, moving on then to the next item. So, item 7, monitoring safeguarding practice. Thank you.
That's me, Chair. I'm here to cover Sue-Ann Lim on her report. So just to start, it's a report here just to be noted, and you can, I'll go through what some of the current pressures are and where some of our performance is at present. And continuing in that kind of same spirit of success, I think really important to note that our social workers and children's practitioners in our statutory teams have been working continuously and still experience the enormous pressure that COVID has brought onto child protection services, and in my view, 5 months into my role, doing a fantastic job. Okay, if we take a look at some of our kind of performance, as I've just mentioned, really, the department continues to receive a persistently high volume of contacts from partners. So that's contacts where partner agencies are requesting a service for children that they've identified as vulnerable. And it does remain the case that a high proportion of those do not meet the threshold for statutory services. So we're working quite closely with our partners to get a little bit beneath that and really understand that some more. And we've also we're achieving some of that by introducing early help into our front door as well, so that we really get that sense of right service, right time for children, but also identifying where there are those windows of opportunity to get in for early statutory assessments or a more intensive targeted piece of work from early help. But overall, performance across the board remains strong. It's routinely monitored, I might say, by our lead member, chief executive and exec director on a monthly basis. which allows for that kind of more routine scrutiny and oversight and challenge as well, because very conscious that our performance tells us one story, I think, when it comes to certainly child protection matters. What we thought would be helpful is if we just captured some assurances more broadly for you about some of our systems and processes, because I'm quite conscious that there's been some high-profile national news around child protection, and as tragic as that is, it provided an extra opportunity, I think, for us to really just stop and think and look and just make sure that those systems are well established, well used, that there aren't any gaps, and to just really double check within that. So just to outline, there's a routine quality assurance process in place for children's social care, so monthly in-depth deep dive kind of file audits that happen, as well as alongside that various dip samples. So if the data makes you particularly curious about something, just getting in there and checking that things are working well. We have also had recently, and I'll mention some more of this a bit later, but some multi-agency assurance visits to different parts of our system. The last one was within our front door, so that single point of contact, and then our assessments and very early child protection decision making. One of the other things I think is really quite important to note when we think about creating positive conditions for good social work practice and to limit opportunities for weaknesses to become gaps in that system, is that Derby does benefit from quite a consistent leadership and management cohort. That not only means that the systems are well embedded, but it means that that history and knowledge of families, services, and the community broader than that is well known. And also we don't have a culture of serious incidents in Derby. That doesn't mean to say that we can have a huge sigh of relief, because it's really important that we maintain that line of sight, I think, on our performance and also the quality of the work that comes in, and also invite our partners, as we have done, to look at our practice and to see child protection as a much more multi-agency approach than just the local authority. And as we know, during COVID, particularly the height of COVID, babies were particularly vulnerable. And since starting in Derby, I've been really reassured actually by a very well recognised and very well established now keeping babies safe strategy. Coming on to our most recent assurance visit, took place in our front door. So that's our initial response team that does the immediate kind of triage, and our multi-agency safeguarding hub, which is the response mechanism for early child protection, where we have reasonable cause to suspect a child may well have suffered significant harm, or that they're likely to. Then our multi-agency safeguarding hub kind of kicks into action, if you like, and decisions are made jointly with police and health about what we do next. What we found from that as a partnership was that there is really good and timely decision making, good threshold application at the front door, and a strong management grip as well. So as soon as we get a referral, managers are there to respond to it, and then when decisions are made by practitioners, they're sound and well considered decisions, but a manager has further oversight at that point. Another really promising factor was that direct work was really seen as part of the rhythm of front door social work. If you like, practitioners were invited to take part in a focus group and to share some of their direct work. And that they were really quite enthusiastic about doing that, to be honest with you, and showcasing the work that they really do to understand what's that journey like for a child and what's a child's real lived experience. That obviously adds a richness and a depth to our assessments and then our next steps decision making. And also our domestic abuse referrals benefit from additional oversight from multi-agency partners as well. So we have a triage function specifically looking at standard, medium and high risk domestic abuse. Finally, just to provide you guys with an update about our COVID recovery and where we're at in that. As I mentioned earlier, the pressure has been enormous on the department. Social workers and our alternatively qualified staff have worked brilliantly, really, to keep children safe in what has been a very tough couple of years. But we are now in a position where the vast majority of our visits are face-to-face. All children will get a face-to-face visit. But if we're aware of symptoms or positive COVID tests, then a risk assessment's done about whether that's virtual or whether that's on the doorstep. For new families coming into the department, that will be at least a doorstep visit. For children who we know and we know well and that we know what the safety plans are, then that may well be virtual. All of our buildings continue to be COVID secure, and that's important when we think about the pressures and the workload social workers are under. They need a base to be able to come to. It's critical for that more reflective practice, for ease of access to a manager, for the peer support. So that's all kind of set up now. And though all of our COVID arrangements are routinely reviewed by us as a heads of service cohort and adapted dependent upon the needs of the public health needs, our workforce, and of course that of children and families. But overall, just to summarise, we are continuing to feel that increased pressure throughout the system. But there are various mechanisms and governance that's in place to make sure that we are responding as appropriately as possible. That's the overview of my report, Chair. Shall I open up to questions?
Okay, thank you. So before I open out to the floor, what extra measures are being put in place to meet any predicted increase in caseloads and pressures owing to the rising cost of living and the impact of that upon our communities?
Thank you. Yes, you're absolutely right. One of my pressures, if you like, is monitoring of the workloads of practitioners across the department. There's multiple kind of things that are in place. So there's a lot of line of sight and governance from myself personally around our more higher risk situations. In terms of caseloads particularly, my deputy heads of service have been tasked recently with let's just have a review and a stock take of where we're at with a lot of families. What does that network now look like? Are we able to move some families to a lower tier of the system, if you like, to really enable them to see the success in their work? And then obviously that means that capacity in statutory services can be hopefully rejigged more focused on the higher end of things. We have also recently secured some investment, which is really exciting. I know our teams are very thankful. So that means that each of my localities will be able to increase their senior practitioner cohort by 1. I felt that's important because of increased workload. We need more senior practitioners to be able to review that work. We are also going to introduce some children's practitioners into our front door. The primary focus of that is when we receive a referral where needs are well known and well understood, the idea of going on to assess that unless absolutely essential, it is a bit of a red herring. Actually, what we need is a short-term intervention. The needs are known, they're well understood. Can somebody get out there in a short phase, wrap around that family, use community resources, use family resources, and enable them to come up with their own plans and build resilience really within that family. So that will hopefully go live soon. We're just in the process of going through HR to get adverts out. And again, we will be increasing some of our children's practitioners in our locality teams as well to hold some of the lower risk and lower need families.
Thank you. Open to the floor. Any questions? Councillor Rawson.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies, my computer decided to do a company reset at the most awkward time ever, as
Happens
always.
to all of us.
I don't know why IT do this to us. I'm sure they do it on purpose. But so just from memory of what I was just reading there, I think you reflect on the number of cases that we've had, and there was some significant increases in the 60% from prior year in the May time, and whether you felt there was any particular reason for those increases, but also you note the comparison, but we don't really have comparable numbers in terms of contacts and how many of those are converted into cases. So perhaps just a bit more detail really as to how many of those, you say averagely 15%, but I suppose, and I see that the cases are 3,750 on average. my memory's working quite well this evening. But I think for us, it's more a case of how does that compare nationally, and how many of those become the complex cases, and how many caseloads are people having to deal with at this moment in time? Are they significantly higher than average? Are they on around the national average? I don't think there's enough detail for me in this report as to give us those reassurances that we require as a group, really.
Yeah. First of all, apologies if you require more detail that isn't captured in the report. I will make sure that any future reports, I think this is routine, just captures some of that conversion as well. It's absolutely right in the report that around 15%. Caseloads are higher than we would like. There isn't a national measure for caseloads. One of the things we've recently introduced as part of our monthly assurance work, I mentioned earlier that there's a routine review of pressures and demands in the system, is that we've started weighting our caseloads a bit more. So what that does is not only look at the number of families or number of children you're working for, but each statutory component of that. So for example, if you are working with a family who are classified as a child in need, and we're heading towards the end of our involvement, that might equal 1 point. But if you're working with a family who are on a child protection plan, that we're heading into care proceedings, and we're doing a number of statutory assessments on families to see where children might be best placed, then of course that's a much heavier piece of work on that practitioner. So we do that monthly, and that's got some additional oversight. In terms of wider conversion throughout the system, it's quite difficult to capture that. I can certainly in the next reports kind of say where things go from our front door after an assessment, but there's so many different directions a family may take dependent upon motivation for change, how quickly services have wrapped around them, any rapid escalation or even rapid de-escalation for a family, that actually they might divert quite quickly. So it would be hard to give a single kind of conversion throughout our system, if that makes sense.
Okay, do you want to respond? Another
Chair,
question?
yeah, if I could just come back on that, I think it's important. So picking up on what the Chair's point was earlier in terms of looking at the reasoning behind these contacts, and those, particularly the around the increasing costs of living and the food support that's potentially needed, and those sorts of things, and how we can support. There's been some fantastic work where we are getting that support to people at an earlier intervention stage, and they're perhaps not hitting these triggers of coming onto here, and so I suppose it's trying to correlate the numbers of those individuals that aren't necessarily reaching this point but would have historically, and perhaps managing that and making sure that we are supporting everybody and we're getting those things through. So just again I think some detail around sort of area types and pressures that we're dealing with, and the narrative of that, and how we as a council can support that with our partners and the community, and where we can target that focus, if you like.
No, I think that's perfectly fair and reasonable, and I think it is definitely something we do look at the categories of harm and the areas of need and how that changes over time. But you're quite right, the more we adapt our system to respond earlier and differently, I think it becomes helpful then to start thinking in terms of impact of all of that, and how we can divert families at an earlier opportunity to other resources.
Okay, thank you. Is there a third wave expected, shall we say, in relation to any predicted increase in children and young people coming to attention, particularly due to historic cases, also due to emerging cases, particularly due to the fallout with domestic violence on the rise, etc.?
Yeah. So we had predicted that we might see an impact based on recent national media coverage. That didn't come to fruition in Derby, but we are carrying out some more assurances around the factors of those situations and what that means to us in Derby. It's tricky to say because so many variables create that kind of peak in demand, and it depends what we're facing. If you look at those numbers of contacts, the increase compared to last year is slowly starting to reduce down. That's still, based on 1920 before then, still considerably higher. But nevertheless, we're starting to get to a bit of a place where we can start to ask ourselves those questions in a more challenging way, rather than having to respond to such peaks of demand. Nevertheless, still continuously very busy. We continue to have to consider all of those things about what might be round the corner, but it certainly feels as if we're heading in the right direction.
Okay, thank you. Any questions? Any more questions from the Councillor Hazelgrave?
Yeah, this increased workload is clearly an issue for everyone. It's sad that there are so many children that are experiencing these issues, but it's a good thing that they're coming to light and they're being dealt with and approached in a professional way and in a supportive way. But I am concerned about the work level of the social workers and all the team. Do managers have a remit to look out for, excessive workload and burnout? Because we don't want that. I mean, the last thing you want is for social workers who are very dedicated and hard-working to become less effective, and maybe the quality of their work declines. So I hope I'm talking about in a supportive way, not some kind of punitive, they're burning out, we'll have to take measures. I mean some kind of support network to make sure that people are helped to manage their workload, or if necessary, some of their workload is taken away from them temporarily so they can get back on track.
Yep, there's 2 points there. In terms of positive that children and young people are still coming to our attention, absolutely. Nationally, we saw a reduction in referrals. That wasn't seen in Derby. So I think the context nationally was so many services shut down that the line of sight on children then wasn't there. But actually, we didn't see that reduction in Derby. And that is a lot of assurances, I think, for us all working in those situations. In terms of burnout and pressures on social workers, absolutely, it's true to say that the complexity of work they're kind of currently dealing with and the volume of work is really tricky set of circumstances. We're fortunate that we've got a lot of experience in our teams. We've got a lot of experience in our management cohorts. We have a very strong assessed and supported year of employment for newly qualified social workers to really build that resilience. We also, in our most recent mock inspection that finished, I think, last week, specifically asked social workers that question about their workload. Did they feel well supported? And people were saying they wouldn't want it to get any higher, and they are working hard through it, and it's because of the support of their managers that enables them to really risk assess properly. But more broadly than that, we've got people can come together a bit more now. So those more subtleties in teamwork, getting together, being able to do team activities. I myself lead a wellbeing kind of working group across the department, thinking through different things we might be able to do just to lift people a bit. And then obviously the corporate response for people who are struggling for whatever reason. So everything is in place that we can, and we're continuing to build on that.
Thank you. Where there is inexperience in the service, what level of training and supervision is provided?
Okay. Yeah, so for inexperienced staff, so those who are new, they have to go through what's called the assessed and supported year in employment. So that's your first year post-qualifying, and you have to create a portfolio which involves a range of kind of reflective practice. It involves additional supervision, not just your line manager, but somebody else to support. It involves that really deep reflection on cases so you can unpick it in a more critical thinking kind of way compared to ordinary, and then various kind of training programs that people have to go on, and they're supported directly by senior practitioners who hold regular group reflective sessions that people can learn from one another in the team, and also a very dedicated principal social worker.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Ralston.
Thank you, Chair. So reading further down in the report, we're looking at the performance percentages down there. And I suppose the question for me is around the single assessments first in timescales, so just 78.8%, the lowest in comparison to December 2021. how does that compare nationally in terms of how quickly we're accessing them and supporting them, and what was the reason for that significant drop, if you like, in comparison to the others? They seem to all sort of hover around the same. I think it's really positive that the reviews are being done. 100% is obviously the best we can be in that area, but I do think we ought to challenge as a scrutiny committee around why those single assessments dipped down to that 78.8% mark.
Yeah, again, welcome challenge on that. I think there's two things in that. One is the timescale, the 45 days that we have, working days, to start and finish an assessment. The other aspect of that is the nuances in that. So within that window, you start a piece of work. So you go out, and I'm confident through my own kind of assurance activity that whilst there was a dip in that wasn't delays in children being seen or our agency checks the components of the assessment, if you like. But there were definitely some challenges with getting assessments, the throughput of it, because of various demand in different places. That doesn't delay a service being provided or a social worker being allocated or anything like that. And as you can see on there, our 6 monthly kind of average at the moment is about 84%. Nationally, the assessment timescales are about 87%, so it is a focus of mine. It is something that teams are working hard on, and we will hopefully see that performance turn the curve. What I would say is my understanding is that there has been historical challenges with our timescales with assessments anyway, so that is really kind of focused on and is improved comparatively.
So just to clarify, it's not that we're not getting out to these individuals, we are getting to those initial sort of one-to-one contacts. It's the delay around the 45 days, and I think that's a reassurance that for me is quite important.
Yeah, and I'm confident in that.
Okay. May I ask, do these single assessments include any parent care needs assessments?
Our single assessments are the statutory child and family assessment. So it does look at parenting capacity and things like that, but it's not the parent care needs assessment, no.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? No? So moving on to the
I do think we need to recognise, Chair, the work that social workers did in Derby over that period when there was lots of needs from children coming to light, and they were there ready to respond to that and give a helping hand. So I do think we ought to thank the team for the work they did day in, day out, quietly, behind the scenes, supporting families and children.
Absolutely. Thank you, Councillor Heatherwave. Can we please note thanks from the board? Thank you. So, moving over to the next item now then, work of the virtual school for looked after children. I think it's over to Graham now. Graham, thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Chair. Good evening, everyone. What I'd like to do through my report this evening is to concentrate on two things. The first part of the report is very much information giving. It is an overview of what outcomes we do have. And the second part is looking at some current work which the DFE have given us in terms of a project which we're currently undertaking. So if I can have the next slide, please. So this is a graph, a series of graphs which show the attendance of looked after children at school during the past 4 years. So you've got 3 blocks. You've got autumn term, spring term and summer term. On the right-hand side, just about 49%. You can see that that was the attendance during lockdown 1. And I know that days can get very confused and when the different lockdowns were, but that was lockdown 1, where it was 49%. If we move back to the middle block, you can see there that the attendance went up to just under 75%, and that was actually lockdown 3, when carers and young people were a bit more confident in going back into school, which were open for them at that time. Okay, next slide, please. The next slide shows exclusions of young people. So young people who were excluded from school. You might hear the term suspension being used nowadays. So a fixed term exclusion is now called a suspension. But back when this data was, it was still a part-time exclusion. You can see there that 6.5 or 6.15% of pupils were or had some form of fixed term exclusion. In normal times, that would be around 10%, anywhere between 10 and 14%. So there were less fixed term exclusions. There were no permanent exclusions during this time. A lot of that was down to some quite hard work by some of my staff in the virtual school team, persuading schools not to permanently exclude and finding alternatives. So we do work very hard at reducing or making sure that permanent exclusion is at zero. Along the bottom there, you'll just see the breakdown of the 31 young people that did get an exclusion. You have the gender breakdown, the SEN status of those youngsters, 25 out of the 31 having some form of special educational need or disability. 4 of those youngsters were in primary, 27 were in secondary schools, and there were 10 youngsters who were in borough, so 10 of those youngsters were in Derby City schools, and 22 of them were in out of borough, so in other local authority schools. You might notice a discrepancy there where 10 and 22 don't quite add up to 31. That's because a youngster was excluded in a Derby City school, moved to an out of authority school and had another exclusion. That's why there is a discrepancy there. Okay, if we move on to the next slide. Now, you might have to refer to any the presentation if you were sent it, but this shows the only attainment or academic outcomes that we're able to present for this academic year. You'll note that the last 2 years the exams have been cancelled. For secondary schools, the GCSEs were awarded according to teacher assessments. In primary, there is no data because schools weren't obliged to pass that data on to anyone. So what we have here is we have the English and Maths GCSE outcomes for the last 3 years that we have data. Well, from 2018, 2019, there's no 2020 data, and then we have some locally sourced data that we've been able to collect as a virtual school. So there is actually no national data to compare against. But across the top 2 graphs, which are the English outcomes, I think we've explained before at committee that GCSE grades are now graded on a 9-to-1 scale. Okay, a 9-to-1 scale, 9 being the highest grade, 1 being the lowest grade. So the data shown there is the percentage of young people in the cohort who have achieved an English grade between a 9 and a 4, and an English grade between a 9 and a 5. Okay, grade 4 and 5 is the old C grade, as was in GCSEs. A grade 4 is you've just scraped through and got the C grade. A grade 5 is seen as a good pass at GCSE. What you'll see there is the English results have stood up and are reasonably comparable with the national results. The maths results have dipped slightly. And in the text, in the green above, there's a bit of an explanation as to why that is. And I always say, coming to committees, that because we are dealing with small cohort numbers, the percentage swings either way can be quite large, depending on the number of youngsters in the cohort. The other things to note are the number of young people with SEND and the prior attainment that these youngsters have had. Okay, I'll explain that because I know it can get quite technical and a bit complicated. But what you can see in the figures is that we had, in the 2021 outcomes, we had a much larger cohort who had much greater special educational needs than the previous 2019 data, where in 2019 it was quite a small cohort and they were quite a bright cohort with less special educational needs. So when you take that as the context, the English results there are really quite pleasing in terms of standing up despite having more SEND needs and a lower starting point. The maths results have dipped, and that would be the explanation as to why those maths results have dipped. No doubt there'll be questions about that later. Okay, on this next slide, we get an amount of money for each young person in care called Pupil Premium Plus funding, and that funding is £2,345 every year for them. What this slide shows is how schools have spent that money and how we have allocated that money to schools for the targets in their personal education plans. So the vast majority is on academic and emotional type support within schools. And you can see there a figure of £475,000 having gone into school through Pupil Premium Plus funding. I'm conscious of time, but we do review all of the targets in the PEPs. Where you can see there, no review, that is where a youngster has been set a target in the summer term, and it won't be reviewed until their autumn term PEP. That's the reason why there is no review there. Okay, if we move on to the next slide, we quality assure every PEP that the schools and social worker signs off. There were 1,100 PEPs in total for this academic year. We grade them gold, green, amber or red, and that's a graphic at the bottom there. 147 gold PEPs, 687 green PEPs, 248 where we thought there was room for improvement, and then 18 PEPs where they just weren't. There were significant concerns about that PEP. We do feedback to schools and social care colleagues around the quality of PEPs that we see. Okay, next slide. I won't dwell too much on this slide. On the left-hand side is a list of all the continuing activities that the virtual school supports for young people in schools. And those are continuing areas of good practice that we continue to fund through some Pupil Premium Plus funding. On the right-hand side is some of the new provision that we've put in place during this that previous academic year. So something called the Chromatin Model. The Chromatin Model is a framework where we can measure the progress that a youngster is making across a range of indicators. Now, we use the Chromatin Model with some of our most disengaged young people. When I first started this job, I worked with a community organisation in the city, and we made some really good progress with a youngster in terms of his social, emotional and engagement with an adult. But at that time, all I had to measure his progress was his percentage attendance at school, which was 0, and it continued to be 0, and his GCSE outcomes. And he was nowhere near attending school. He did actually, at the end of it, get a GCSE grade 2 in maths, which was remarkable. But what I did with the community and voluntary organisation was I created this framework called the Chromatin Model, which looked at the areas where he needed to make progress. And that model has been refined and developed over a couple of years, and we're now using that in the enhanced care planning meetings across the city with the youngsters in the children's homes. The second area there is something called BKSB. Now, this is just a diagnostic tool which measures where a youngster is at with their maths and English. What we found was that several young people were becoming looked after late in their secondary school life, and we as a virtual school had to pick them up, and we didn't necessarily know what level they were functioning at with their maths and English. So we commissioned this company called BKSB, and they have an initial assessment tool which allows us to find out where they're at so that we can support them in moving forward with their maths and English. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the extended duties of the virtual school. The DFE back last summer decided that the virtual school was to have a role to promote the education of all children with a social worker. All children with a social worker. So that means that the remit was broadened from looked after children, and in 2017 we got some additional responsibilities for post looked after children, so that was youngsters who were adopted or in special guardianship orders. But last summer the government gave us some responsibilities for all children with a social worker, so that was youngsters who were on child protection plans and children in need. It was a strategic role, the DFE said. It was a strategic role, so we were not to work with individual youngsters or individual families, but we were asked to work across education and social care to try and make the system work better for all youngsters with a social worker, and to narrow the attainment gap. Now, that did make a lot of virtual schools smile, because the project funding was for 6 months. So I'm not quite sure what we were expected to do in terms of close that attainment gap in 6 months. We are waiting on an announcement from DFE, which will hopefully extend the life of the project. There was some money on the table which DFE grabbed from Treasury at the time to get the 6-month project off the ground. We're waiting now for Treasury to put their hands in their pockets and to continue the funding of this project, which we are hopeful will come very soon. So what we've done in the time that we've had this 6-month project, we have developed a framework which will look at a universal offer, a targeted offer, and a specialist offer across the work that we do. So currently there are 4 key elements to that work. There will be a staff training offer for education and social care staff. We're going to look to work to improve the attendance and reduce exclusions of CP and CHIN kids. We're going to do a SWOT analysis to identify any system-wide improvements that can be made, and hopefully some quick wins there. And then we're going to look at the governor support and accountability across, well, certainly for schools. So, on the next slide, just a quick what we've achieved so far. We have written and recorded an 8-module e-learning trauma and attachment course, which we are looking to trial and to roll out, certainly within schools, and we're in discussions with social care colleagues to see if it will be suitable for social care staff as well. We've created a Pupil Voice film, which outlines 4 young people's experience of being in care. We've developed a self-evaluation tool for schools to actually benchmark where they think they are at with their processes and systems for all children with a social worker. Aligned with that, there's a template for a governor's report. So governors across the city should be able to get a standard report which the school designated safeguarding lead will write, outlining their provision for children with a social worker. And then some of the quick wins, we've made some links with exclusion colleagues, the transition portal, the issue of part-time timetables and mentoring. So we're making sure that youngsters who are on CP and CHIN plans are highlighted within these processes. So very simply, a simple example would be on the exclusions report that a school sends into local authority, it identified whether a youngster was looked after or not. But so we very simply asked colleagues to put in whether the youngster was on a CHIN, CP and LAC. So we can then identify where youngsters are who are in CHIN and CP are being excluded from school. So what you might ask, we've then got the apprentice who works in that team to then, on that day that the exclusion has been reported to us, to email the social worker to say, did you know this youngster on your caseload was excluded from school? And that's just a simple, quick win where we can work with the systems we've got to highlight the disadvantages that these youngsters experience. So what we're doing, we've got to launch a lot of the project work we've trialled, or we've put in place, sorry. So we're going to roll out the e-learning and the self-evaluation and governors reports. We've got a couple of SWOT analysis sessions set up. We're going to look to see if there's any mileage in RAG rating youngsters who are on CHIN and CP plans. To see where the greatest need is, so we can target resource to those youngsters and families to try and support them, but also to stop them becoming LAC. And then one of the big issues we have is around creating baselines and getting attendance, exclusions and academic outcomes for these particular groups, to try and pull those data sets outside or into a format that we can use. Interestingly, when the DFE first announced this, the remit was for any youngster with a social worker or who had ever had a social worker. There was a national survey of virtual school heads asking how many people could get that data. And out of the 151 local authorities in the country, I think the Scilly Isles said that they could do that, but no one else could. So that was quite interesting. And I think the DFE might rewind that piece of guidance and maybe be a bit more realistic in terms of the cohort that we've been asked to work with. So that's a very quick whistle-stop tour. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Graham, and thank you for such a comprehensive report and all the work you've put into that again. Thank you. So am I correct in that there are now systems in place to ensure that data is regularly being collected and analysed?
Certainly data for the looked after children is definitely there. We're working with data colleagues in the local authority to pull out the attendance and attainment data for the youngsters in schools. I don't think it's there yet, and we need the systems from social care and education to talk to each other a bit more efficiently, but certainly I would think by the summer we'll have a much better handle on that. We certainly have an idea of which schools those youngsters are attending, and this is the sort of the debate nationally really about the DFE saying on one hand you've got a strategic role here, but then if we're looking at attendance and exclusions of CHIN and CP kids, you need to get down to the the nitty-gritty and the youngsters and who those youngsters are. So there's a bit of tension in the system around that. But we're working at that.
Yeah, thank you. I note there's no previous data to compare the exclusions to specifically, so that is why I asked if there are now systems in place to ensure that we can capture that.
We certainly have historic exclusions data for looked after children, but we don't have historic data for exclusions of CHIN and CP youngsters. Because that was never recorded on the return that came to the local authority.
Yeah, sorry, can you just say that again? You've not the CP youngsters?
Yeah, for youngsters who are on CHIN and CP, we don't have access to any exclusion data for those youngsters in any systematic way.
Okay.
For looked after youngsters, we as a virtual school collect all that exclusion data.
Right. Okay.
We could, if we went through records, look at exclusions of youngsters who had a social worker, but that's as general and as broad as the data would show us. It wouldn't show us if they were CHIN or CP youngsters.
Okay. Thank you. Any questions from the floor? Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. Excellent report that I've just been forwarded by Councillor Cuss. Can I just ask, Chair, why this was given to Councillor Cuss but not given to any of my group's committee in advance?
I don't know. I would have to ask the officers on that. I do apologise, and I will ask to ensure that they are sent out in future. Thank you, Councillor
Thank you.
Wilson.
If we can have any reports like this in advance, it does help us to enable us to scrutinise a little bit better.
Absolutely, I totally agree. Thank you. Any further questions? Councillor Hazelgrave.
Just a bit of an observation. I remember a couple of years ago we did get a report from one of the Ofsted staff, who's an officer in the authority, a qualified Ofsted inspector, about the fact that there was clear evidence that our SEND children were underperforming in our schools when looked at in terms of the national picture, in terms of attainment and achievement. I'm really pleased to find we've got somebody who's going to be effectively a champion of asking schools to make sure they have high expectations of all children and SEND children inclusively. And clearly there's evidence of really good practice. Graham obviously works with children in quite adverse circumstances in terms of getting the best out of their time in school and making the best progress. And he's come up with some good tools there that he mentioned, this Chromatin Model and the BKSB. So I do hope he can have a kind of consultant role in terms of working with schools where maybe the expectation isn't as high as it should be and it needs some work doing on it.
So, I very much agree. I think the looked after children get a really good deal from virtual schools, and I think that's the reason why DfE have given us a wider remit, because they've seen that CHIN and CP youngsters can fall through the cracks. Yeah.
Any further questions? No. So moving over then to recommendations to consider the presentation 2.1, 2.2 to make any further comments or recommendations following discussions on the presentation received. I would like to put over a recommendation to Cabinet to propose that Cabinet ensures appropriate systems are in place to track and monitor children and young people within the virtual schools remit to help identify rising issues and inform future planning. Are we all in agreement with that? Anyone against? No? Okay, any further recommendation? No? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Graham. Okay, so moving on to the next item now, item 9, Early Help Annual Report. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll try and be as succinct and as quick as possible, but I don't want it to detract from some of the good stuff that's in the report. So I think, first and foremost, it's important to recognise that this covers the year April 20 to March 21. So it's always delivered in arrears, really to ensure that you can see a full year's performance. And I want to just focus on the introduction to the report, which really does give the detail around what Early Help did during the pandemic, because I think we were quite crucial to a number of services as far as in maintaining. It was a business as usual for us, along with our social care colleagues, that whilst we didn't see families always face to face, we did see a lot. We did garden gate, park visits, we became very creative. So the presentation just really gives you an overview, and it's a reminder of what Early Help does. So Early Help supports targeted interventions where there is an emerging need or a piece of joint targeted work. And one of the reasons we're there is to prevent escalation into the higher tariff statutory services, so the services that Andy now manages. So if you look at what we've got, we have responsibility for delivering a targeted early help service, which includes casework. So that includes the one-to-one solution-focused work with families who are needing some kind of support. And it's where the early help worker becomes the lead professional, and we manage a team around the family process to ensure that we get the right results. We're responsible for children's centres, which obviously has the responsibility for 0 to 8s and group work, casework, and that core offer around family support, school readiness, which I think is key, and health and wellbeing support as well. We've moved towards delivering evidence-based programmes. So any programmes that we deliver for parents or for children always have an evidence base, because, you know, that keeps the fidelity of any programme, really. So we deliver things like non-violent resistance, which is around managing the behaviour of sometimes really challenging children and young people. We deliver domestic violence programmes, so things like Freedom, and we've recently trained our staff to deliver Freedom for Children. So that's a piece of work targeted at 6 to 10-year-olds who have been in the household and witnessed domestic abuse, and you know that actually is becoming much more common. In addition, there are programmes like Incredible Years, and we've now got a manager who trains all staff within early help but also social care in something called systemic interventions. So actually the whole bit around a strengths base, looking at what a family can offer for themselves and choosing a particular way of delivering that. We're also responsible for a number of statutory services, so children missing, so those children and young people who go missing, and the delivery of the missing protocol. Those children who are missing from education, so that's not children who are without a school place or are on part-time timetables. It's those children who tend to get lost in the system. So we've got a CME officer who tracks those children. Often it's a lot of Eastern European children who often go back to country of origin for a number of months, and we just track so that we know that they're not missing out on their education. Education Welfare Service, which obviously looks at attendance and penalty notices. NEAT, which is the Not in Education and Training for those most vulnerable 16, 17-year-olds, and young carers. Recently, and during the pandemic, we've received some money from Public Health to deliver support to the 0 to 19s Healthy Child programme at Lavistock Court, and for those families who came into the hotel in the city centre during the Afghan crisis, and really to support those families, particularly those that are staying in the city, to ensure they've got a school place, that they're registered with a GP, that they've got all the services that they need to enable them to function appropriately within the city. And I manage the contracts for things like Safe Families for Children, and supporting vulnerable families, which was formerly troubled families, priority families, now supporting vulnerable families. So I manage the operational delivery for that. So, next slide, please. This just gives you an overview of some of the key findings, and I think number of cases 2021 was only 610. That's only 50% of our work, because all the other things that I've mentioned take the other side of our work. But I think we need to consider that this was during a pandemic, and there was a reduction in early help assessments. Schools were really focused on just making sure children were ready for learning. We spent a lot of time supporting schools to track their children, so we weren't expecting that we'd be inundated with early help assessments. However, when I come this time next year, if I'm still here, you will see an increase, because we're seeing, as Andy said, an increase month on month, the number of early help assessments. So during 2021, it was 930. Of our cases, 159 cases were stepped up to social care, and that's a reduction of 114 from the previous year. And I think that's about our targeted approach and our decision making around threshold. I think we've got stronger as time's gone on to understand the threshold between what could sit safely within early help and doesn't need to step up into social care. And we've seen roughly around the same over a year, only 21 cases coming back within 3 months if we've closed the case. So I think that tells us that we're safely closing cases at the right time. And again, the number of cases we've screened for CRE and CSE is 330, which is an increase on last year. And I think particularly the focus on CRE, we're all seeing a rise in risk to young people. Next slide, please. So, performance. I think as a combination of statutory and non-statutory services, I've always been, in the 10 years I've been in role, very clear that we have to really demonstrate that we do a good job. So we measure our performance on what we call progression tools. So that, for anybody that doesn't understand, is a tool that we use with a family when we first start to work with them. And we ask a series of questions that could be in a way that a parent or a family together can answer very honestly, and then we track the progression. So we look at it at the start of an intervention, after 3 months, after 6 months. If we close at that point, we sign it off. If we don't, we continue to track over a 3-month. And of 562 progression of change tools, 560, so 98% of the work we've done has showed an improved direction of travel. We also have something, and I probably shouldn't have abbreviated it there, it does look funny, WIFI, but it is how was it for you. So, you know, I'm conscious of what Paula was saying about surveying families, but actually we found for us it really works because it asks questions such as, How did you feel about our intervention? Were you treated with respect? And it's always completed at the end of any intervention. And it does remain high. It's over 96%, which I think, does show good performance. During the year, we've had over 60,000 contacts with children and young people, and that was particularly during lockdown periods. So we spent a lot of time supporting our colleagues in social care, catching up with schools on a weekly basis to check on children that they weren't sure where they were. And I think, some of the things Graham was saying about data, it's not easy to track attendance when children aren't in school. And we sort of filled the gap, I guess. What we have done is create a new team during lockdown. So prior to lockdown, I'd done a management restructure where I'd had a saving attached to it, and we'd created a new team called Staying Together. And on the next slide, I'll give you more detail. But we've also, I think what working from home has enabled us to do is to pull together a really dynamic virtual offer right across the 0 to 19 age group. So whether you're a neat young person, whether you're a mum with 2-year-olds, a mum that needs some early support pre-diagnosis, or needing an ASD drop-in, we've been able to create quite a dynamic offer, which we will continue to offer alongside that face-to-face work. Okay, next slide, please. So, Staying Together. Staying Together was a preferred title to children on the edge of care, because I think if you talk to a family about edge of care, it gives them an idea, particularly for parents who are at the end of their tether and possibly saying, I can't cope, I don't want the child in the family anymore. We felt that by using those positive words, staying together, it supported families in a strengths-based way to remain together and focused on what they need to do to make their family work well together. So that was around putting in some really tight wraparound services, and very quickly. So if we've got a family where things are breaking down, one child in a family, or all children in a family, we put a really tailored package around them. We've worked with over 50 families so far, and I've cost avoided over £1 million in just over 14 months. So it's not a saving, it's a cost avoidance, because the number of children coming into care, these 50 could have been on top of the 628 we've already got. And we've calculated it on what it would cost. And there's a really good example. I don't know whether anybody's seen the BBC documentary that was done by Ashley John Baptiste, which is called Split Up in Care, Life Without Siblings. It's on the iPlayer. It's going to be on BBC Three, and it was on the BBC News channel over the weekend. Sue-Ann wanted me to put the clip on here, but I would get into all sorts of trouble with copyright, and I didn't think it was the right thing to do. But there's an excerpt on Derby that features a member of staff from the Staying Together with Ashley John Baptiste, the reporter, and they talk to a parent, and it talks about the positive work that we're doing. So I would appeal to all of you to watch it. It's a great documentary, and I think what it does for Derby is shows that there's some really good work, not only in Staying Together, but there's an interview with Sue-Ann afterwards. But obviously, from my point of view, I was set some tasks, and that was about, we need to look at the reduction of the number of children in care, and actually the pressures that puts on our budgets. And, I see my role in this is that actually, It's a whole service budget pressure. It's not just Andy's budget pressure, it's not just Andrew Kaiser's budget pressure, it's all of ours. So actually this piece of work showed how we can really support this. Next slide and final slide. So what next for us? In the report you'll see that the action plan's there with some narrative on all the individual tasks. But what I wanted to just draw your attention to is I am going to be remodelling the service again, and you know, in the 10 years I've been in this post, it's nothing new to me. But actually building on the ethos of the Staying Together team. So we're looking to create a citywide CRE team, so putting some experts to try and prevent those children who are perhaps low, medium risk, escalating to high risk, and sometimes entering the criminal justice system or having to be placed out of the city, which is quite costly to us, by making sure that they don't reach that point. Paula noted the development of family hubs. I'm the strategic lead in the city for family hubs. We've put a bid into the DFE, to the Transformation Fund. We hope that we're successful. We'll develop family hubs, whether we are or not. And the first, we've set up a family hubs strategic board. The first meeting is happening on the 2nd of March. And what we've done, we've had some money through the East Midlands DCSs, and we've invested in colleagues in CVS, so in Kim Harper's team, to help us develop that. And I think regardless of whether we're successful with the bid, this is our way forward, really. And we want to continue to deliver the first-class service that we've done for a number of years, and really move towards consolidating that strength-based model that's borne out in our Staying Together team and other teams that we're going to create. That's me done.
Thank you. I'd just like to thank the team for all their hard work and dedication. It's a very comprehensive report. We can see a lot of, I'm sure we can all see a lot of work has gone in to putting improvements in the service and managing through very difficult times. I think there's some very good examples there of the benefits of conducting surveys and how that's helped you progress as a survey too. So I'd like that noted. Our thanks as a board, please, to the team for early help. Thank you. Any questions? Councillor Hesbury.
I share your enthusiasm for what we've heard tonight, because it's a really good story. And, you know, it's pretty obvious, I would hope, to everyone that early intervention is best if it's effective. Not only in terms of turning things around and making sure children can stay in their families and stay safe in their families, but also it costs a heck of a lot less, and we haven't got much money going around, so that's great. I did look at the kind of appendix where it talked about you were looking at the NEAT policy, because I mean I do think that's a really important area for those people who, you know, 1 minute they're in school and the next minute they seem to disappear out the system and start to become hard to reach. And when they're hard to reach, that's really a tough nut to crack. So I'm glad that the figures are similar to national, but I'd like to see us really be a beacon for, you know, really getting on top of trying to avoid NEETs being in the system, because, you know, it means they're not going to progress in life, or their life chances are going to be severely curtailed.
January's figures are better, so I've had them literally today, and we're at 4.4%. Overall 5%, and we normally sit around the 6.87, but I have to say I'm making savings as part of medium-term financial plan on the team, so I'm going to have to look at the way we deliver that service.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions? Councillor Ralston.
Thank you. I mean, that is concerning when you look at you noted there the medium-term financial plan. Obviously, from experience with that, we all know that as a city, we've got to look at every option here. But when you look at the savings that were potentially achieved from within your service, it's not just about the money. Don't for 1 minute think that that's what I'm saying, because we know that outcomes for these people will be much more improved, and it's far more important. But what I wouldn't want us to do is risk creating those pressures again by not having this team doing the work that they need to be doing to keeping those families together. And it is something that, you know, as we all need to think about, and we know that the service across the whole of the council needs to be considerate of the financial pressures we're under, and it's a catch-22 position. We all understand that. But I think, yeah, for me, the question is, do you think that potentially could have a longer-term impact, a reduction on that on your service, whilst putting this forward?
Yes, I do. I've really struggled. You know, I've been in this job a long time. I've got a lot of experience, and I've done some awful savings over my time with children's centres, childcare, all of those sorts of things. I think this has been the most difficult year for me, and particularly that Saturday before Christmas, when the headline in the Telegraph was "Early Help saves £750,000," you know, and it does worry me. Now, I'm fairly passionate about the work, and so is my team, so we'll do everything in our power to make sure that we do the best we can with what we've got. But actually I do worry about particularly the NEET, that actually we won't be able to do as much.
Okay, any further questions? Councillor Heathergrave, do you have a question?
A kind of recommendation is coming to mind, Chair. I don't know if there are other questions first.
Yeah,
we'll leave
hold
it
on
later.
for any further questions first. Thank you, Councillor Heathergrave. What backlog is there, if any, in the service due to the impact of COVID?
There isn't any, because we've absolutely worked flat out during COVID. It's not been the same, but I think it's enabled us to be quite creative. And I would say that one of the positives of being a non-statutory service is that I can be creative, so I can change things, do things differently that perhaps Andy can't in his position because he's got a statutory responsibility. So I think what we've tried to do is look at what we can offer virtually, how we can do things differently. The Family Hubs initiative from DFE is Sure Start, regenerated, but 0 to 19, 25 for children, young people with a special need. But what it means is that I'm just more creative with it, really. But I wouldn't say... I think it's been a challenge, and I think what we've recognised and what Andy alluded to is our frontline teams need to be backing officers. We need to be... staff need to be together. So wherever possible, we're trying to do that in our bases at Stanley Road, at Ash Tree, in our children's centres. Bit more of a challenge here because of all the crosses, but we're trying to work with it as far as... So I wouldn't... I think, well, staff have amazed me. If I'm really honest, I am, you know, people who know me well know that I'm passionate about what I do, but I think each and every member of staff is.
Thank you. Any further questions? No. So we'll move on now to the recommendations. Thank you very much. So recommendation, consider the contents of the report and make appropriate recommendations. So Councillor Heathergrave, I know you had a recommendation.
Yeah, I'd like people to consider that we urge Cabinet to be vigilant that reduction in scope and capacity of early help team does not lead to consequent budgetary pressures down the line.
I would probably go further than that and add that they ensure, that Cabinet ensure that funding and sustainability of the early help service.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, certainly. And when you're on exec scrutiny, you'll be on exec scrutiny, so you can put that forward then as well, hopefully.
I can put it forward to Cabinet,
Yeah.
if it's agreed here today. So can we agree that recommendation then? Yeah, anyone against? Let's see any hands. No, nobody against? No. So we all for yes?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Right, take silence, there's agreement. So, right, okay. Any further recommendations?
Chair, just to thank the whole team for the really impressive work they've been doing with families during this really tough time, and helping them stay together and progress.
Yes, absolutely. I would agree with that. Is there an issue, Councillor Ralston?
No, not at all.
No, are we happy with that recommendation then? So just to clarify the two recommendations then, so all in favour, if we can do all in favour? Yeah. Okay, yeah, that's passed. So let's go to Cabinet. Have we noted to go to Cabinet? Yeah, yep. So any further recommendations? Right, okay, so I think we've added clarity. Right, so item 10 then, moving on to item 10 on the agenda. So appointment of co-opted members. So the recommendations, if we can go through them, perhaps go through them one by one. So recommendation 2.1, to note and endorse the nomination of Tracy Churchill to the board, and to request that council approve her appointment as the Catholic Diocese representative for another 4-year period from the 31st of January 2022 to the 31st of January 2026. We all agreed? Yeah, all agreed. None against? No. So 2.2, to note and endorse the nomination of Nikki Fenton to the board, and to request that council approve her further appointment as Church of England representative for a further 4-year period from the 31st of January 2022 to the 31st January 2026. We all agreed? Yeah, all agreed. So 2.3, to note the process for nomination and renomination of the remaining co-opted or the faith representative is ongoing, and I will do the others together with that. 2.4, to note that the nominations for 2 to 5 co-opted parent governors were received from the local authority maintained schools. The nomination request process will be repeated in 6 months. And 2.5, to note that council will be asked to approve the nominations for the 2 co-opted faith representatives, the Catholic Diocese and the Church of England. Are we happy to accept those? Yes? Yes, all agreed, none against. Okay. So moving on now then to item 11, which is the work programme and topic review. Are we all happy with that? Anybody like to add anything else? Anything you would like on the agenda?
Chair, I don't know whether we're losing track of early years dental care, or there was a suggestion, I think, that we have a joint meeting with adult and social care about
Absolutely, yes. There has been a suggestion that we have a joint meeting with adults, and the board will be invited in due course, I believe. So, anybody like to add anything else onto the agenda? Nope. So all happy with that? Okay, I think we will close the meeting now. Thank you everybody for coming today. Thank you very much. Thank you.